At the dawn of 1991, the Soviet Union stood as a colossal presence on the world stage. It stretched across one-sixth of the Earth's land surface, a vast empire of over 22 million square kilometers, encompassing nearly 300 million people from more than 100 distinct ethnic groups. This nuclear-armed superpower projected its influence across Eastern Europe and far beyond, appearing outwardly strong and immutable. Yet by the end of 1991, this once mighty union of republics had ceased to exist. The red flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, marking the quiet end of an era. Such a monumental collapse did not happen overnight or from a single decisive blow. It was the result of a slow and steady unraveling that took place over decades, largely from within. Beneath the surface of Soviet power were deep structural cracks, flaws in the economic system, rigidities in governance, and tensions in the social fabric that widened gradually until the whole structure gave way. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union experienced a creeping stagnation. Factories kept churning and the machinery of state ground on, but the sense of forward momentum faded. Growth faltered, and with it, the optimism and ideological certainty that had once fueled the Soviet project began to ebb. This script traces the peaceful, inexorable decline of the Soviet Union, from the height of its post-war strength to its final dissolution in 1991. It is a story of an empire's quiet dusk rather than a dramatic implosion, an extended period of stagnation and decay punctuated by attempts at reform and moments of crisis. We will explore how long-term weaknesses in the Soviet economy and government structure set the stage for decline. We will see how political stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev's leadership sapped vitality from the system, leading to a pervasive decline in productivity, morale, and innovation. We will step into the daily lives of Soviet citizens during these waning years, observing the shortages, routines, and quiet resilience that defined everyday life from the 1970s into the late 1980s. As the narrative progresses, rising currents of nationalism and ethnic unrest begin to strain the seams of the multinational union. The war in Afghanistan emerges as a costly venture that further undermined confidence in the leadership. When a younger reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev, attempts to revitalize the system through Glasnost, openness, and Perestroika, restructuring, his initiatives bring hope, but also unintended consequences. The new freedoms and half measures of reform expose truths and unleash forces beyond the party's control. Economic chaos intensifies, and calls for change grow bolder. We witness how these efforts at saving the Union instead accelerated its disintegration, culminating in the dramatic events of 1991. A failed coup by hardliners in August, and the final dissolution of the USSR by December of that year. Through each chapter of this chronicle, the tone remains calm and reflective, much like the gradual twilight that fell over the Soviet Union itself. This is not a tale of sudden catastrophe or fiery revolution, but of a slow, meditative decline, one that allows us to observe the details and understand the processes at work. In the end, the Soviet Union's collapse was the sum of many quiet failures and deferred problems. Let us begin by examining the foundations of the system to understand the long-standing weaknesses that set the stage for the slow collapse of the Soviet Union. Long-term structural weaknesses. The Soviet Union's collapse was rooted in long-standing structural weaknesses in its economic model and system of governance. These weaknesses had existed for decades, even as the country rose to superpower status. By the 1970s, the limitations of the centrally planned economy and the one-party state were becoming increasingly evident. The economy, once able to achieve rapid industrial growth by sheer force of centralized planning and resource mobilization, had begun to lose steam. After dramatic expansion in the 1950s and the early 1960s, growth rates declined significantly in the subsequent decades. During the late 1960s and 1970s, economic growth slowed to a crawl. Annual growth that once averaged around 5 to 6% in the mid-20th century fell to barely 2 to 3% by the late 1970s. By the early 1980s, the Soviet economy was effectively stagnating, with some measures of productivity even showing negative trends. An over-centralized, inefficient economy, the command economy that had propelled the Soviet Union's early development, was becoming a source of inefficiency. Central planning required bureaucrats in Moscow to set production targets, prices, and resource allocations for everything from steel and machinery to shoes and bread. This system had succeeded in building heavy industry and military might, but it struggled to manage a complex, modern economy. Without real market prices or competition, there were chronic mismatches between what was produced and what people needed. Factories often met their quotas by focusing on quantity over quality, turning out products that were shoddy or unsuitable, but still counted as fulfilled targets. Scarcity of everyday consumer goods became a defining feature of the economy. It was common for Soviet citizens to find store shelves empty of items like meat, sugar, or decent clothing. When goods did appear, long queues formed as people rushed to buy whatever was available, fearing it might not return for weeks or months. Behind these shortages lay deeper problems. The agricultural sector, for example, never fully recovered from the disruptive collectivization of the Stalin era. Despite vast swathes of fertile land and a huge rural workforce, the USSR struggled to feed its population. The state-run farms were often inefficient, plagued by outdated equipment and poor incentives for workers. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union, once envisioned as a self-sufficient grain producer, had to import millions of tons of grain from abroad just to keep bread on the table. This reliance on imports underscored the system's failure to deliver on one of its most basic promises: adequate food for all. Meanwhile, the economy's emphasis on heavy industry and defense production came at the expense of consumer industries. A large portion of national output and the brightest scientific and engineering talent was channeled into the military-industrial complex. The Soviet leadership prided itself on achievements like tanks, rockets, and nuclear missiles, along with giant steel mills and oil fields. However, this heavy industrial focus diverted resources from producing consumer goods and modernizing the light industries that made everyday items. By the late 1970s, Soviet citizens could see that while their country built formidable weapons and sent cosmonauts into space, it lagged in producing basic household appliances or quality clothing. Many urban families waited years for an opportunity to buy an automobile or a decent refrigerator. Such goods were luxuries reserved for the patient or well-connected, and even when acquired, they were often of subpar quality compared to Western products. Lack of innovation and technological lag. The centralized system also stifled innovation. Because the state controlled all research and development, and bureaucratic planning emphasized meeting planned targets above all else, there was little incentive to innovate or improve efficiency. Enterprises that met their quotas were rarely rewarded for doing better, and those that failed were usually bailed out by the state. Managers and workers learned that keeping one's head down and fulfilling the plan, even in a mediocre fashion, was safer than experimenting with new methods that might fail. Over time, this led to technological stagnation. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union fell behind the West in key areas of technology, such as microelectronics, computers, and consumer electronics. While Soviet scientists excelled in military and space research, the absence of a dynamic market and the fear of political repercussions for failure meant that translating scientific ideas into better consumer products was exceedingly difficult. This innovation gap became more apparent as the world entered the information age. The Soviet economy, with its antiquated factories and lack of computing infrastructure, was ill prepared for the new era, the black market and informal economy. In response to the inefficiencies of the planned system, an unofficial second economy bloomed beneath the surface. This included a black market and informal networks of barter and favors, known as BL8. Enterprising individuals would steal or divert goods from the state supply chain and sell them privately, or use connections to obtain scarce items. By the 1980s, this shadow economy had grown significantly, a testament to how the official economy failed to meet people's needs. Although illegal, these practices were often tacitly tolerated to keep society functioning. The existence of a substantial black market, accounting for a notable share of economic activity, highlighted that many Soviet citizens relied on unofficial channels to obtain goods and services that the state system could not provide efficiently. Fiscal strains and resource dependence. Another structural weakness lay in how the Soviet economy earned and spent its resources. The government heavily subsidized basic goods to keep prices low, which meant it spent vast sums on price supports and welfare provisions. This was sustainable in times of economic growth, but as growth slowed, the cost of maintaining this social safety net and the sprawling state sector became a heavy burden. The USSR increasingly depended on exports of natural resources, especially oil and natural gas, to earn hard currency, foreign exchange, and to prop up the budget. In the 1970s, high global oil prices provided a windfall that masked some of the systemic inefficiencies. Oil and gas revenues bankrolled food imports and supported the Soviet Union's extensive military commitments and international aid to allies. However, This dependence on commodity exports was a vulnerability. When oil prices plunged in the mid-1980s, the Soviet economy was hit hard. The sudden drop in revenue exposed the fragile foundation on which the state's finances rested. It became difficult to sustain the import of grain and consumer goods, or to maintain the generous subsidies that kept domestic food prices artificially low. What had been an unseen crack in the foundation widened into a serious fissure once this external prop faltered. Rigid one-party rule and bureaucracy, hand in hand with economic flaws, were the structural weaknesses in Soviet governance. The political system was a rigid one-party dictatorship that concentrated all decision-making in the hands of a small elite. For much of the Soviet Union's existence, especially after the 1930s, political power was centralized in Moscow, where top Communist Party officials and state bureaucrats made plans and policies for the entire country. This highly centralized governance created several problems that grew over time. One issue was the lack of genuine feedback or corrective mechanisms. Without free elections, independent media, or opposition voices, the leadership could not easily gauge the real conditions in the country or the populace's true sentiments. Lower-level officials were often afraid to report bad news up the chain of command, fearing it would harm their careers. As a result, the problems festered. Corruption and mismanagement were frequently covered up, and the true extent of economic and social issues was papered over by rosy official reports. The bureaucracy itself became another source of inertia. Over decades, an entrenched class of officials, the nomenklatura, enjoyed secure positions and privileges. These bureaucrats had little motivation to risk their status by pushing for reforms or acknowledging failures. Instead, they often prioritized maintaining stability and their own perks, even if it meant resisting necessary changes. Policies once set in motion were hard to change, as any policy shift required navigating a labyrinth of party committees and ministries, each jealous of its authority. Furthermore, the Soviet system discouraged local initiative. Republics, regions, and enterprises were expected to follow directives from the center with minimal deviation. This meant that policies were often poorly adapted to local conditions. A farming directive, suitable for the fertile black soil of Ukraine, might be irrational when applied to the arid plains of Central Asia, but local managers had limited authority to adapt. Over-centralization made the system inflexible and often unresponsive to the diverse needs of a vast country. Social contract and its erosion. In the post-Stalin decades, an implicit social contract developed. The populace would accept the party's monopoly on power in exchange for stability, basic social services, and a predictable if modest standard of living. The Soviet state provided employment for virtually everyone, free education and health care, and subsidized housing and food. For a time, this bargain held. However, as economic stagnation set in, the state's ability to uphold its end of the deal began to wane. Housing remained scarce and cramped. Consumer goods were limited and often shoddy, and the quality of services declined. Educated citizens, especially the younger generation in the 1970s and 1980s, grew increasingly aware that their counterparts in Western countries enjoyed higher living standards and personal freedoms that they lacked. As the Soviet system struggled to deliver improvements, cynicism spread among the people. The older generation might reminisce about the sacrifices of the past and the victory of World War II, but younger Soviets saw an economy and political system that seemed stuck in time and unable to fulfill their aspirations. In summary, by the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was a superpower with feet of clay. Its economy was vast, but suffered from low efficiency, stagnant innovation, and chronic shortages that affected daily life. Its government was powerful but rigid, staffed by aging leaders and bureaucrats who were increasingly out of touch with a changing world. These deep structural flaws did not doom the Soviet Union to immediate collapse. For a time, the system could limp along, but they created a fundamental brittleness beneath the facade of stability. When pressures mounted in the 1980s, whether economic strain, popular discontent, or the push for reform, the cracks in the foundation would widen, setting the stage for the slow collapse that was to come. The Brezhnev era and political stagnation. By the mid-1960s, after the tumultuous reforms and upheavals under Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leadership opted for a return to stability and conservatism. Leonid Brezhnev emerged as the paramount leader in 1964 and would remain in power until his death in 1982. His tenure is often remembered as the era of stagnation, a period marked by relative calm on the surface, but growing stagnation underneath. Brezhnev's approach to governance was encapsulated in the phrase stability of cadres. In practice, this meant keeping the ruling elite and bureaucratic officials in their positions for long periods and avoiding the kind of disruptive shakeups that had characterized Khrushchev's rule. Party officials and managers enjoyed secure tenures and steady privileges, which bought their loyalty and ensured political tranquility at the top. But this very stability bred inertia. Fresh ideas and dynamic leadership were increasingly scarce, as the same cadres simply rotated among positions or stayed put for decades. Gerontocracy and conservatism. As the 1970s wore on, the Soviet leadership grew older and more entrenched. Brezhnev himself aged visibly, becoming physically frail in his later years, and many of his Politburo colleagues were elderly men who had risen through the ranks long ago. Decision-making at the highest level often moved at a glacial pace. Caution and consensus were valued over innovation or bold change. Policies tended to emphasize continuity, maintaining the status quo and preserving the Communist Party's absolute hold on power. In many respects, Stalin's oppressive terror was not revived. Brezhnev was a far milder ruler in that sense, but so too were Khrushchev's bold reforms, largely halted or reversed. Instead, the government promised citizens peace, order, and modest prosperity in exchange for their acquiescence to one-party rule. In effect, the country was governed by a gerontocracy, rule by the olds. By the late 1970s, and this leadership appeared increasingly out of touch with a society that was slowly changing around them. Under Brezhnev, the Kremlin cultivated a narrative of success and stability. The Soviet Union achieved nuclear parity with the United States in these years and expanded its influence abroad. Propaganda touted the mature socialism or developed socialism that the USSR had supposedly attained, an acknowledgement that the promised utopia of full communism was still distant, but that the current system was a stable, established socialist society. In the early part of Brezhnev's rule, especially the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was a sense of pride among many Soviet citizens. The country seemed strong. It had a large military, a successful space program, and was respected as a superpower. Internationally, Brezhnev engaged in détente with the West, signing arms control agreements like the SALT treaties and basking in the prestige of the Soviet victory in World War II, which remained a cornerstone of national pride. Yet beneath this veneer of strength, signs of stagnation were evident. The very term, era of stagnation, often attributed to Gorbachev's later critique, captures the sense that by the mid-1970s, the Soviet system had run out of forward momentum. Economically, as noted earlier, growth had slowed dramatically, something the average citizen felt in the form of persistent shortages and little improvement in living standards. Politically, the stagnation was characterized by a lack of new ideas or directions. The Communist Party's annual congresses and Brezhnev's speeches became ritualistic and laden with repetitive slogans, increasingly divorced from the realities of everyday life. Brezhnev himself became a subject of subtle ridicule. His penchant for awarding himself military medals and honors, even creating the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for himself multiple times, struck many as indulgent. Jokes circulated quietly among the people about the aging leader's slurred speeches and the ossified state of the leadership. Of course, open criticism was dangerous, but within private kitchens and circles of trusted friends, Soviet citizens often expressed cynicism about their rulers. Suppression of dissent. The Brezhnev era also saw the reassertion of tight political controls and suppression of dissenting voices, albeit through more bureaucratic and less bloody means than in Stalin's time. While the regime did not typically resort to mass terror, it used the KGB and the courts to ensure that open opposition remained minimal. Dissidents, those who dared to speak out for human rights, democracy, or greater freedom, were harassed, arrested, or forced into exile. Notable intellectuals and writers, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who exposed the horrors of the Stalinist Gulag system, were expelled from the country. The nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov, who became a vocal advocate for civil liberties and against nuclear proliferation, was stripped of his honors and internally exiled to a closed city, Gorky, for years. Lesser-known activists who tried to publish underground literature, samizdat, or form informal study circles were kept under close watch. Some were imprisoned or declared mentally ill and confined to psychiatric hospitals, a grim tactic employed to discredit and silence dissent. Censorship under Brezhnev remained pervasive. The state tightly controlled the press, television, literature, and arts. Only officially approved messages and works were allowed wide circulation. Still, a gray zone existed, a limited sphere where creative individuals could push boundaries cautiously. Some literature and films in the 1970s subtly criticized aspects of Soviet life, as long as they could be interpreted as aligned with socialism or not overtly political. But direct challenges to the system were not tolerated. The overall effect was a cultural atmosphere that, like the economy and politics, felt stagnant. Many artists and intellectuals resigned themselves to self-censorship or retreated into private life rather than risk confrontation with the authorities, foreign policy, and the burden of empire. In foreign affairs, Brezhnev's era aimed to maintain the Soviet Union's superpower status and the cohesion of its bloc of satellite states in Eastern Europe. This had significant political and economic repercussions at home. Brezhnev enunciated what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, which declared that the USSR had the right to intervene in any socialist country if socialism there was threatened. This doctrine was dramatically put into practice in 1968, just a few years into Brezhnev's rule, when Warsaw Pact troops led by the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring reforms. The invasion sent a clear message that political liberalization would not be allowed in the Eastern Bloc. While it succeeded in its immediate aim, it further sealed the Soviet leadership's commitment to a conservative, unyielding course, and it strained relations with the wider world, particularly with Western nations that condemned the action. The Soviet commitment to its allies and client states also meant a heavy economic burden. The USSR provided extensive aid and subsidized oil to allies like Cuba, Vietnam, and others, and maintained a massive military presence from East Germany to Afghanistan after 1979. Defense spending surged as the Soviet military expanded to match American power around the globe. While these policies projected strength, they also diverted immense resources from domestic needs and tied the Soviet Union to costly engagements that would come back to haunt it. Social conditions during stagnation. On the home front, social services and living conditions, which had slowly improved in the post-war years, began to show signs of decay by the end of Brezhnev's reign. Despite the regime's promises of continued progress, hospitals and clinics were underfunded and increasingly outdated. Education quality suffered from a rigid ideological curriculum, and the housing shortage persisted. The Brezhnev government did achieve some successes in welfare. Pensions and basic security for citizens were maintained, and a generation grew up without the fear of war or mass repression, but the system seemed unable to take the next step toward providing a better life. Alcoholism became a widespread problem during these years, partly a response to boredom and lack of opportunity. Vodka was cheap and heavily consumed, leading to public health issues and reduced labor productivity. The leadership mostly ignored these social ailments or addressed them superficially, wary of any measure that might stir public resentment or require fundamental change. By the time of Brezhnev's death in November 1982, the Soviet Union was in a holding pattern. Its problems acknowledged only quietly or not at all by those in power. Brezhnev was given a grand state funeral, and the pomp of that occasion momentarily shrouded the reality that the country he left behind was adrift. The transition after Brezhnev did not immediately break the pattern of stagnation. Indeed, it highlighted it. Two more elderly leaders followed in quick succession: Yuri Andropov, 1982 to 1984, and Konstantin Chernenko, 1984 to 1985, each serving only a short time before dying in office. Andropov, a former KGB chief, was somewhat more keenly aware of the need for reform and at least attempted to rein in corruption and push for discipline, famously urging Soviet workers to learn to work properly. But his initiatives were cut short by his illness and death. Chernenko, in poor health from the start, largely continued Brezhnev's stagnant style until he too passed away after just 13 months in power. The Brezhnev era, therefore, flowed into the early 1980s as a time of missed opportunities and accumulating pressures. It was a paradoxical period. Externally, the USSR still appeared formidable and unyielding. Internally, the foundations were slowly rotting. Many Soviet citizens felt a mix of pride and frustration, proud of their country's stature, but frustrated by the unchanging routine, the lack of material improvement, and the sense that the leadership was mired in the past. This widespread stagnation of the Brezhnev years set the stage for the dramatic attempts at change that would soon follow under the next much younger leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. But before that turning point arrived, the Soviet Union would continue to experience a decline in productivity, morale, and innovation, an outgrowth of the very stagnation that Brezhnev's long rule had entrenched. Declining productivity, morale, and innovation, one of the clearest symptoms of the Soviet Union's deepening malaise in the late 1970s and early 1980s, was the decline in productivity and the erosion of morale among workers and citizens. As the economy slowed, it was not just a matter of statistics on a balance sheet. It was palpable in factories, offices, and farms across the country. People were putting in the hours, but often with diminishing returns. There was a popular wry saying in those days, "They pretend to pay us, and we pretend to work." This dark joke captured the cynicism of the Soviet labor force. Wages were low and often had little relationship to effort or productivity. A factory worker or a collective farmer would receive roughly the same predictable pay, whether he toiled diligently or merely went through the motions. In turn, many workers responded to this lack of incentive by reducing their effort to the minimum needed to avoid trouble. Stagnant and wasted labor. The planned economy, with its guaranteed employment for all, led to what economists call hidden unemployment or underemployment. Many workplaces were overstaffed. It was common to find 3 people doing a job that one person could handle, because enterprises were rewarded for having large workforces and meeting output quotas, not for efficiency. In some cases, factories met output targets by hiring more hands rather than improving processes or machinery. This meant that while official figures showed near full employment, the reality was that a significant portion of the labor force was not fully productive. Moreover, the lack of advanced machinery and technology in many industries meant that even hard work did not translate into high productivity. By the early 1980s, the growth of output per worker, labor productivity, had ground to a halt and even turned negative in some sectors. Simply put, the Soviet economy was getting less output for each hour of labor than it used to, a stark contrast to the improving productivity seen in Western economies, where innovation and market competition drove efficiency. A contributing factor to low productivity was the prevalence of absenteeism and on-the-job indifference. Workers would sometimes arrive late, leave early, or find ways to idle during the workday. It was an open secret that many people would slip out of work to run personal errands or even partake in a quick drink. In the early 1980s, when Yuri Andropov briefly took the helm of the country, he ordered spot checks to find truants, resulting in anecdotes of officials discovering factory workers at movie theaters or shopping during work hours. Such stories, while sometimes exaggerated, held a kernel of truth. Discipline in the workforce had slackened after years of uninspired management. Without real fear of unemployment, the state, after all, guaranteed jobs, and with diminishing faith in the system, many laborers had little motivation to exert themselves beyond the minimum required. Morale and the loss of faith. The human spirit behind the Soviet system was similarly flagging. The grand ideological fervor that had once underpinned enormous efforts, like the industrialization drives of the 1930s or the rebuilding after World War II, had largely dissipated by the 1970s. Most Soviet citizens in the Brezhnev era carried on with life, but the sense of participating in a great socialist project had faded. Official propaganda still extolled the virtues of communism and the eventual triumph of the Soviet way of life, but such rhetoric increasingly rang hollow. People could see the contrast between promise and reality. For example, propagandists might praise the USSR's technological prowess in producing steel or launching satellites. But ordinary people were more immediately concerned with the fact that buying a decent pair of shoes or a fresh piece of meat had become a frustrating ordeal. The younger generation, in particular, felt a kind of quiet disillusionment. They had grown up after Stalin's terror, in relatively more benign times, and many had received a good education, only to find themselves in a system that offered limited opportunities for personal advancement or expression. Membership in the Communist Party or its youth wing, the Komsomol, was often pursued out of necessity for one's career rather than genuine belief. As a result, a certain cynicism permeated daily life. People learned to say one thing in public and another in private. In schools and workplaces, they repeated the slogans required of them, but at home they would voice doubts or make jokes about the system's failures. The proliferations of political jokes, told in whispers among trusted friends, itself was a barometer of morale. Humor became a coping mechanism for a populace that felt powerless to change a sclerotic system. Social indicators reflected this malaise. Rates of alcoholism, as mentioned, climbed through the 1970s and early 1980s, a sign that many coped with monotony or disappointment by turning to drink. Public health, which had improved in the post-war years, began to stagnate or worsen. Perhaps the most stark measure was life expectancy. In a striking reversal of typical progress, Soviet statistics revealed that the average lifespan, especially for men, stopped increasing and even declined during the late 1960s into the 1970s. By the early 1980s, a Soviet man could expect to live only into his early 60s on average, several years less than his counterpart in Western countries, and a decline from 2 decades earlier. This drop was largely attributed to excessive alcohol use, poor diet, and the strains of life in a stagnating society. It was a sign that something was fundamentally wrong in the social fabric. Innovation grinds to a halt. The Soviet Union had long prided itself on its scientific and technological achievements, and indeed, in areas like space exploration and military technology, it remained a peer of the United States through the 1970s. However, outside of these showcase sectors, innovation in the broader economy was sputtering. The command economy provided little reward for taking initiative. An engineer who came up with a more efficient design for a machine, or a scientist who invented a new consumer product, often found that the bureaucratic system was uninterested in adopting changes that might disrupt established plans and production routines. Without patent rights or profit incentives, and with layers of bureaucracy to navigate, many potential innovators either gave up or confined their creativity to theoretical research rather than practical application. Additionally, due to the regime's tight control over information, Soviet scientists and technologists were often isolated from global developments. Importing new foreign technology was sometimes seen as ideologically suspect unless it related to defense. When the personal computer revolution began to sweep the West in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Soviet Union lagged far behind. Most Soviet offices and factories still relied on paper and outdated mechanical equipment, as microelectronics and computer engineering remained underdeveloped, except in certain military contexts. By the time the Soviet leadership recognized the need to computerize and modernize industries, they found themselves years behind, trying to reverse engineer or clandestinely acquire Western innovations. This lag in adopting new technology further contributed to poor productivity and the growing gap in living standards compared to the West. The culture within enterprises also discouraged innovation. Managers were risk-averse. Their promotions and bonuses depended on hitting targets set from above, not on creatively exceeding them. A failed innovation could mean a missed quota and thus punishment, whereas sticking to the old ways and safely meeting a mediocre target was better for one's career. Over time, this mentality drained the system of its dynamism. By the 1980s, it was clear that many Soviet products, from cars to electronics to consumer appliances, were outdated in design and often inferior in quality to what could be bought in Western stores. Even Soviet citizens who had never traveled abroad were increasingly aware of this gap through samizdat writings, foreign radio broadcasts, or stories from friends who had seen the outside world. This awareness further eroded pride and morale. It is dispiriting for a population to sense that their country, despite its superpower status, cannot deliver the same standard of living or technological convenience that exists elsewhere. The human element, declining morale and innovation also had subtle psychological effects. A society that stops believing in its future is one that starts living day to day with little long-term hope. By the late Brezhnev years and into the early 1980s, many Soviet citizens had adopted a kind of defensive apathy. They focused on their private lives, tending their small garden plots, dachas, finding solace in family and close friends, and tuned out the lofty pronouncements of the state as mere background noise. Enthusiasm was reserved for private pursuits, a hobby, a black market enterprise to earn a bit extra, or the cherished moments of entertainment like a popular film or a sports victory. This was not a population poised to rise up in anger. Rather, it was a population sinking into a collective shrug, a resignation that this is just how things are. Such widespread apathy and decline in work ethic were not total. There were always exceptions: dedicated teachers, diligent scientists, proud soldiers, and more. But the general trend was unmistakable, and crucially, some within the Soviet elite recognized it. By the early 1980s, a number of more forward-thinking officials, including a rising star named Mikhail Gorbachev, understood that the country could not thrive if its people had lost their drive and its economy had lost its edge. The decline in productivity, morale, and innovation was both a cause and a consequence of the broader stagnation. It set up a vicious circle. Stagnation bred low morale and low innovation, which in turn deepened the stagnation. Breaking out of this cycle would require dramatic changes, something the next generation of leadership would attempt, with very mixed results. But before examining those reforms, it's important to appreciate another dimension of the late Soviet decline: the everyday life of Soviet citizens who experienced these abstract declines in very concrete ways in their daily routines and struggles. Everyday life in a declining superpower, 1970s to 1991. For the ordinary people of the Soviet Union, the grand themes of stagnation and decline manifested in the humble details of daily life. In the 1970s and 1980s, everyday existence in Soviet cities and villages was a mix of routine hardship, communal spirit, and a resigned adaptation to scarcity. The state promised to take care of everyone's basic needs, and in a technical sense it did. There was little homelessness, virtually everyone had a job, and essential food staples were usually available at low official prices. But the quality and variety of life's necessities often left much to be desired, and acquiring them could be an exhausting quest. Housing and living conditions. Housing was a perennial concern. The Soviet government had undertaken massive urban housing construction programs since the 1950s, erecting countless concrete apartment blocks that became the iconic landscape of Soviet towns. By the 1970s, many families had moved out of older communal apartments, where multiple families shared one flat, into these newer units. Still, space was limited. It was common for a family of 4 to live in a cramped 2-room apartment in a high-rise building with a tiny kitchen and thin walls that offered little privacy. Young married couples often had to live for years with parents or relatives while waiting for their own apartment. Assignment from the state, a wait that could last a decade or more. The interiors of these apartments were modestly furnished, often with the same standard issue furniture sets produced by state factories. Home life revolved around simple routines, cooking meals from whatever ingredients were on hand, gathering around the television in the evening to watch the news or a favorite film, and tackling household chores that were sometimes more arduous due to lack of modern appliances. For example, laundry might be done in a semi-automatic washing tub or even by hand, and then hung to dry on balconies or ropes strung across the room. Heating and utilities were centrally provided and virtually free, which was a boon during the long, cold winters, though breakdowns were not uncommon and had to be stoically endured until a state maintenance crew came. In rural areas and older city neighborhoods, some people still lived in traditional wooden houses or dilapidated structures with coal, stoves, and outdoor toilets, especially in the earlier part of this period. Even as the government touted progress, a considerable portion of the population made do with very basic living standards. The daily quest for goods, perhaps the most defining feature of Soviet everyday life, was the scarcity of consumer goods and the time spent obtaining them. Shopping for food and supplies was not a casual errand, but often a central occupation, especially for women who typically managed the household. State shops, magazines, were infamous for their long lines, queues, and often empty shelves. One never knew what might be available on a given day. Shoppers might enter a store to find, for example, a sudden delivery of winter boots or imported East German coffee, and a line would instantly form as word spread and people rushed to seize the opportunity. It wasn't unusual for people to spend hours in line for a single product, or to join a line without even knowing what was being sold at the front, simply because the sight of a line meant something desirable was attainable. Food shopping was a daily trial. Basic staples like black bread, potatoes, cabbage, and vodka were generally in stock, though even bread could sell out by evening. However, items like meat, butter, or fresh fruit were sporadic treats. Many families relied on seasonal local produce, cabbages and potatoes to last the winter, or on what they could grow themselves. In fact, a huge savior for many urban families was the small garden plot, dacha, allotted to them outside the city, where they would cultivate vegetables and fruits during the summer. Come harvest time, families labored to pickle, can, and preserve as much as possible for the lean months. Jars of homemade pickles, jam, and compote lining the shelves of a pantry or balcony were a common sight, a hedge against empty stores. When a sought-after item did appear in stores, it often disappeared just as quickly due to hoarding. For example, if sugar was suddenly available in quantity, people might buy far more than they immediately needed, knowing it might not be seen again for a long while. This contributed to chronic shortages, as the distribution system simply couldn't keep up with demand surges. In the 1980s, the situation in some respects worsened. By the late 1980s, the breakdowns in supply due to economic turmoil led to official rationing in certain regions. Coupons were issued for commodities like sugar, tobacco, or detergent, limiting how much one person could buy in a month. The sight of people carrying string bags, avoskas, everywhere, just in case something became available unexpectedly, was emblematic of this era. The black market and coping mechanisms. Soviet citizens developed resourceful ways to cope with shortages. Barter and informal exchange were widespread. If a person had a friend who worked in a bakery, they might get an extra loaf in exchange for, say, helping that friend repair a car or obtaining some item from their own workplace. Networks of acquaintances, blat, could be crucial. Knowing someone in a clothing store, a butcher shop, or a warehouse could mean the difference between going without and securing a hard-to-find item, while outright buying and selling at above state prices was illegal and risky if done openly. A shadow economy thrived in discreet ways. In many cities, a visitor could find open-air markets, the so-called collective farm markets, or Rhinoc, where private sellers offered food at market prices, often produced from the countryside or meat from privately raised animals, which, though more expensive, was fresher and more reliably available than in state shops. In these markets, one might also quietly encounter people selling imported goods or home-crafted items in defiance of state monopoly. Another staple of daily life was the constant improvisation and repair of old goods. Because new consumer goods were scarce, people became adept at fixing things or finding substitutes. A radio or a bicycle might be kept running for decades through tinkering. Clothing was mended repeatedly. Old garments were repurposed. There was a popular culture of DIY solutions, a kind of make-do and mend ethic that was part necessity, part tradition. Leisure and media. Despite the hardships, Soviet people did carve out time for leisure and found enjoyment in community and culture. Television was a major source of entertainment and information. With only a couple of channels available, families across the country often watched the same films, sports events, and news programs. Popular Soviet films, often comedies or dramas with relatable everyday themes, became beloved touchstones that people quoted in conversation. Sports, especially soccer, football, and hockey, were avidly followed. A big game could temporarily unite everyone in excitement and provide a break from daily worries. The Olympic Games of 1980, held in Moscow, though partly overshadowed by a U.S.-led boycott, were a moment of pride and a festive diversion for many citizens as the world's spotlight turned to their home. Printed media, tightly controlled by the state, focused heavily on political content, party congresses, industrial successes, international events through the Soviet lens, but people still read newspapers and magazines in large numbers. There were also magazines on science, hobbies, literature, etc., which were quite popular. For a more candid or thrilling read, some turned to samizdat, self-published materials, like typewritten copies of banned books or foreign publications, passed hand to hand in secret. These were dangerous to possess, but they offered a window into ideas and stories outside the official orthodoxy. The late 1980s brought a dramatic change to the media landscape with Gorbachev's Glasnost policy. Suddenly, newspapers began reporting on previously taboo issues: poor housing, corruption scandals, the troubled state of the economy, even historical atrocities like the Stalinist purges. Soviet citizens, who for decades had been told only the official version of events, were both shocked and invigorated by this new candor. Long suppressed topics like the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact or the Katyn massacre of Polish officers were discussed openly. This openness deeply affected everyday conversations and perceptions. Neighbors and co-workers would discuss the latest daring article or a revelatory TV documentary, processing a flood of truths that had been hidden. Glasnost also meant exposure to more foreign media and arts, which flooded in as censorship relaxed. People could watch previously banned films, read translations of Western literature, and even see the nightly TV news broadcasts that started to resemble Western journalism in their criticism of problems. Community and social life. Socially, life in the Soviet Union often had a communal character, born out of both ideology and necessity. Neighbors in an apartment block might know each other well, borrowing items or looking after each other's children. It was common for groups of co-workers to spend time together outside of work, celebrating holidays or going on group outings, such as organized trips to the countryside or beach. The workplace itself tried to foster a sense of community. Offices and factories had periodic socialist competitions and team achievements, and workers might gather for obligatory political meetings or for events like sabbatniks, voluntary community work on Saturdays. While some of these were perfunctory, they added to the collective rhythm of life. Weddings, funerals, and other life events were typically big community affairs, bringing together extended family, friends, and colleagues. The Soviet state secularized many traditions, but people still celebrated with enthusiasm. A wedding, for instance, would involve a civil ceremony at a registry office and then a lively reception, often held in a cramped apartment or a local community hall, with tables laden as much as possible with special foods and plenty of drink, toasts, and songs. Such gatherings provided joyous relief from the everyday grind. Religion, though officially suppressed, quietly persisted in many families, especially among older generations and in certain regions. For example, the predominantly Muslim Central Asian republics or Christian communities in parts of Ukraine and the Baltics. By the 1980s, the state had somewhat relaxed active persecution of religion, though churches and mosques were few and under surveillance. Some people would still secretly baptize their children or celebrate religious holidays in private, blending those traditions with the secular Soviet calendar. Changes in the late 1980s. By the period of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost in the late 1980s, everyday life underwent rapid and sometimes bewildering changes. Economically, as Gorbachev's reforms struggled, shortages got worse. In many cities, by 1989 to 1990, the queues grew longer than ever, and items that had been taken for granted, like soap or laundry detergent, became scarce. Rationing cards returned for the first time since the immediate post-war years in some regions, limiting how much a person could buy. At the same time, the first legal private businesses, cooperatives, appeared, introducing new dynamics. Suddenly one might see a private bakery or cafe open up, offering better service or goods at much higher prices. Those who had access to hard currency, foreign money, or rubles earned from cooperatives could shop in special stores, often called beryozka or others, that sold imported goods, a stark new inequality that average citizens noticed with some envy and resentment. Socially and politically, the late 1980s also brought phenomena unimaginable a decade prior. Public demonstrations and meetings in the streets, local elections with actual choice of candidates, and an uncensored press debating the country's future. For many Soviets, these changes were both hopeful and disorienting. After a life of relative political passivity, people were now urged to engage in discussions about reform, to vote, to form informal groups. In some cities, Especially in the Baltic republics or parts of the Caucasus, large rallies for national autonomy or independence became part of daily news. Even if one was not participating, one saw it on TV or heard neighbors talk about it. Everyday life had become politicized in a way that it hadn't been in the stagnant 1970s. Despite this upheaval, some elements of daily life remained constant up to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. Families still gathered around simple dinners. Friends still met for a stroll in the park or tea in the kitchen. Children still went to school in their uniforms each morning. The resilience of ordinary people in adapting to their circumstances was one of the Soviet society's defining traits. They endured through shortages with humor and solidarity, and when new freedoms and new challenges arrived, they navigated those as well, step by step. In December 1991, when the Soviet Union formally dissolved, there was no sudden change in the fabric of daily life. People still woke up the next day and went about their business. But the world around them had shifted profoundly over the preceding years, and the uncertainties and possibilities of a new era were knocking on the door, ready to reshape the patterns of everyday life that Soviet citizens had known for generations. Rising nationalism and ethnic tensions. The Soviet Union was by design a multinational empire. It spanned 15 union republics and dozens of smaller autonomous regions, each with its own distinct ethnic groups, languages, and histories. For most of its existence, the Soviet state had managed ethnic diversity through a combination of suppression and token acknowledgement. On paper, each republic had its own government, flag, and official language alongside Russian, and Soviet ideology preached the brotherhood of all peoples united in building socialism. In practice, however, real power was centralized in Moscow, and policies often promoted the Russian language and culture as a unifying force. Local nationalism was viewed with deep suspicion by the KGB and Communist Party. Any open expressions of separatism or even too much pride in local traditions could be branded as bourgeois nationalism and repressed. This kept a lid on ethnic tensions for decades, but it did not eliminate them. The sentiments survived underground or in private, passed down quietly through generations. By the 1970s, the Soviet leadership liked to speak of a new historical community, the Soviet people, in which ethnic distinctions were supposedly fading into irrelevance. In reality, beneath the surface, many non-Russian groups harbored historical grievances or aspirations that never fully disappeared. For example, the Baltic peoples, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, remembered their brief independence between the world wars and quietly resented their incorporation into the USSR during World War II. In Ukraine and Georgia, nationalist dissidents circulated samizdat literature, celebrating their nation's languages and cultural heroes, even as the official line stressed socialist unity. Muslim-majority republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus maintained strong local customs and clan networks that the atheistic, Russified Soviet culture never entirely replaced. For much of the Brezhnev era, these undercurrents remained muted. Occasional flare-ups, such as riots in Kazakhstan in 1979 against the proposal of a new Russian-majority autonomous region, or the 1978 demonstrations in Georgia when Russians briefly tried to downgrade the Georgian language's status, were swiftly contained and not widely reported. It was during the Gorbachev years, with the loosening of censorship and control, that nationalism surged back into the open. As Glasnost allowed people to voice previously forbidden opinions and to learn truths about history, many ethnic groups began openly reasserting their identities and grievances. The very reforms meant to strengthen the Soviet Union unintentionally uncorked forces that would tear it apart. One of the earliest and most dramatic sparks came from the Caucasus. In February 1988, a smoldering dispute in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, an Armenian-populated enclave within the Azerbaijan Soviet Republic, burst into the open. The Armenian majority in Nagorno-Karabakh sought to transfer the region to Armenian jurisdiction, citing cultural ties and historical grievances. This request, seemingly administrative, ignited passions on both the Armenian and Azerbaijani sides. Massive demonstrations took place in Yerevan, Armenia's capital, in support of Karabakh's unification with Armenia, while equally large rallies in Baku, Azerbaijan's capital, protested any change. Soon, violent incidents followed. In the industrial town of Sumgait in Azerbaijan, mobs attacked Armenian residents in late February 1988, killing dozens in a gruesome pogrom. News of this bloodshed spread through Samizdat and whispers, since Soviet media was initially hesitant to report it, shocked the country. It was the first instance of ethnic mass violence within the USSR in decades. It became grimly clear that old ethnic hatreds, long suppressed, were still alive. As the central authority wavered and public expression became freer, a chain reaction of nationalist movements unfolded across the Union. In the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, citizens formed mass organizations like the Popular Fronts, initially calling for greater autonomy and language rights, and then rapidly moving toward demands for full independence. Here, nationalism had a strong footing. These were among the most economically advanced republics with literate populations that had maintained their languages and a memory kept alive through families and exiles abroad of sovereignty. Peaceful demonstrations in the Baltics drew huge crowds waving their national flags, which had been banned under Soviet rule. On August 23, 1989, to mark the 50th anniversary of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had consigned the Baltics to Soviet control, citizens of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined hands in an astonishing human chain stretching over 600 kilometers from Tallinn to Vilnius, the Baltic Way, dramatizing their desire for freedom. Further west and south, Ukraine experienced a national awakening as well. Long a culturally divided land, with a heavily Russified east and a more nationally minded west, Ukraine saw the rise of movements such as Ruch, the People's Movement of Ukraine, advocating greater cultural rights and eventually independence. Centuries of domination by Moscow, and before that by the Russian Empire, fueled a growing insistence on official status for the Ukrainian language and a recognition of historical tragedies like the Holodomor famine of the 1930s, which had been taboo to discuss. By 1990, large demonstrations filled Kiev and other cities, and the blue and yellow national flag reappeared in public. The Caucasus, already set alight by the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict, saw other ethnic strife. In Georgia, a strong nationalist undercurrent led to demands for the preservation of Georgian language rights and the removal of lingering symbols of Russian dominance. In April 1989, Soviet troops cracked down on a peaceful pro-independence rally in Tbilisi, using shovels and gas. More than a dozen demonstrators, mostly young women, were killed. This tragedy only strengthened Georgian resolve to seek independence, making martyrs of the victims. Meanwhile, in various corners of the Caucasus and Central Asia, interethnic tensions surfaced. The Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan saw riots in 1989 targeting the minority Meskhetian Turks, leading to deaths and an exodus of that community. Clashes between Georgians and the Ossetian minority in Georgia, and later between Ossetians and Ingush in the Russian North Caucasus, foreshadowed post-Soviet conflicts. These episodes revealed how the loosening of authoritarian control allowed long-standing frictions to explode, often to the surprise and dismay of the local population who had lived side by side with other groups under the Soviet friendship of peoples narrative. Even among Russians, a sort of nationalism, or at least a reassertion of Russian sovereignty, took shape. Paradoxically, it was Russia, the largest republic and the core of the Union, that dealt a decisive blow to Soviet unity from within. Boris Yeltsin, a prominent reformer who became the leader of the Russian Republic's parliament in 1990, championed the idea that Russia should reclaim authority from the Soviet center. In June 1990, the Russian SFSR declared its own sovereignty, meaning that Russian laws took precedence over USSR laws on its territory. This was not a declaration of independence per se, but it was a dramatic act. The Central Soviet government suddenly had its own largest republic, asserting the right to ignore Union directives. To many Russians, this move was appealing not out of ethnic chauvinism, but from frustration that their republic, which bore the lion's share of the Soviet budget and responsibilities, lacked the privileges that smaller republics had. If non-Russians were pushing for more autonomy or exit, why should Russia itself be bound to the old arrangement? Thus, Russian nationalism in this period often took the form of a democratic populism that aligned with dismantling the old Soviet order. By 1990, virtually every republic had seen the rise of popular fronts, or movements demanding change. Moldova agitated for recognition of its Romanian linguistic identity and an end to perceived Russification. In Central Asia, movements were more subdued in some republics. Often the communist elites co-opted nationalist rhetoric to maintain control. But even there, the idea of greater sovereignty took hold. The Soviet parliament under Gorbachev even passed a law allowing republics to secede, theoretically regulating a process for leaving the Union, though with steep conditions. The genie of nationalism was out of the bottle. What made these nationalist surges especially powerful was their broad base of support. These were not just fringe groups or exiled intellectuals. They included factory workers, students, local party members, and often even elements of the local security apparatus. The Communist Party organizations in the Baltics, for instance, essentially transformed into nationalist parties by 1990, as it became clear that aligning with the popular will was necessary for political survival there, Ethnic tensions and nationalism not only fueled peaceful political processes like declarations and elections, they also led to the risk of civil conflict. As the Union unraveled, some of these conflicts would erupt into full wars, such as the Armenia-Azerbaijan War over Karabakh, or the Georgian struggles with Abkhaz and Ossetian separatists, which flared up around 1992. Within the lifetime of the Soviet Union, the leadership in Moscow found itself increasingly unable, and in some cases unwilling, to use force to hold the empire together. Gorbachev, despite occasional hardline actions, he sent troops that killed protesters in Tbilisi in 1989 and again in Vilnius and Riga in January 1991 in ill-fated crackdowns on the Baltic independence movements, largely refrained from the massive violence that would have been necessary to truly cow the republics back into obedience. By the time the hardliners attempted exactly that, in the August 1991 coup, as we will see, it was too late. The nationalist fervor and desire for sovereignty in many republics had passed the point of no return. In summary, the rise of nationalism and ethnic tensions in the late 1980s acted like tectonic forces splitting the foundations of the Soviet Union. What had long been officially a tight union of indestructible republics turned out to be fragile once the cement of authoritarian control began to crumble. Each republic's push for self-determination, whether calm or chaotic, eroded the legitimacy and authority of the center. What began as a series of local movements for language rights or historical acknowledgement quickly evolved into a broad repudiation of Moscow's rule. This process greatly accelerated the Soviet collapse, ensuring that by 1991, it was not only the economy or the political system that was in crisis, but the very territorial integrity of the Union state. The stage was set for a final sequence of events, triggered in part by these nationalist pressures that would bring the Soviet era to an end. The war in Afghanistan and its toll. In December 1979, the Soviet leadership made a fateful decision that would become one of the most costly blunders of the late Cold War, the invasion of Afghanistan. What was intended as a quick intervention to prop up a friendly communist government in Kabul turned into a grueling decade-long war that many would compare to America's Vietnam. The Soviet Union, at the height of its military power, found itself mired in a conflict in the rugged mountains and deserts of Afghanistan, fighting guerrilla rebels, the Mujahideen, who were fiercely dedicated and increasingly well armed by Western and regional powers. The war in Afghanistan had a profound impact on the Soviet Union's trajectory, both materially and psychologically. A protracted conflict. The initial invasion was swift. Soviet airborne and ground forces toppled the Afghan leader, who had grown unreliable in Moscow's eyes, and installed a more pliant communist regime. But holding onto Afghanistan proved far harder than seizing it. The Soviet army soon became entangled in counterinsurgency warfare against a diffuse enemy that blended into the local population and had sanctuaries in neighboring Pakistan. The Mujahideen fighters, supplied with weapons and money by the United States, China, and other countries, waged an effective hit-and-run campaign. They ambushed convoys, shot down helicopters, famously with American Stinger missiles in the later years, and proved resilient despite heavy casualties. The Red Army, designed for large-scale conventional warfare in Europe, was ill-prepared for this type of mountain guerrilla war. Soldiers, many of them young conscripts, faced not only a determined foe, but also harsh terrain, a hostile local populace, and a growing sense that their mission was futile. As the years dragged on, the human and economic costs mounted. Some 15,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives in Afghanistan, and many more were wounded or maimed. These numbers, though far smaller than the Soviet losses in World War II, were significant in a peacetime context, and for a war whose purpose was increasingly questioned. Additionally, it's estimated that over 1 million Afghans were killed in the conflict, with millions more displaced as refugees, a humanitarian tragedy that weighed on the conscience of many even within the USSR. The financial burden was also immense. The Soviet military poured vast resources into the war, not just combat operations, but also an effort to support the Afghan government, supply its army, and build infrastructure as part of a Hearts and Minds campaign. In a period when the Soviet economy was already stagnating, the war became another drain on the treasury, siphoning funds that could have potentially been used to improve civilian life. Domestic disillusionment. For most of the war's duration, the Soviet government maintained a tight grip on information about Afghanistan. In the early years, news coverage was scant and always positive, depicting brave Soviet soldiers helping Afghan villagers, building schools, defending against bandits. However, reality seeped in through other channels. Soldiers on leave or discharged would tell their families and friends about the real conditions, the ambushes, the death of comrades, the often confusing rationale for being there. The Soviet public began to see evidence of the war in the form of zinc coffins returning from Afghanistan, often delivered quietly to avoid public scenes. These were euphemistically termed Cargo 200. Every such coffin arriving in a town brought the distant war home to a community and raised questions that officials struggled to deflect. By the mid-1980s, especially under Glasnost, Afghanistan became a subject of more open discussion. It was increasingly referred to not as a heroic enterprise, but as a quagmire. People started using phrases like "our Vietnam" to describe it. War weariness spread not only among the public, but also within the establishment. Many officers and politicians privately doubted that a clear victory was achievable. Mothers of soldiers, an important moral voice in Soviet society, began to organize and demand answers about why their sons were dying in a foreign land for an ill-defined cause. The effect on morale, especially among the youth, was significant. The war had been launched by the old guard, Brezhnev's generation, but it was being fought by the younger generation, many of whom returned home disillusioned, traumatized, or physically scarred. These veterans, known as Afghansi, often struggled to reintegrate into a society that wasn't fully aware of or appreciative of what they had endured. Some turned to alcohol or drugs. The war had introduced many Soviet soldiers to Afghanistan's plentiful opium and heroin. The government provided some veterans benefits, but the social support was insufficient. As Glasnost took hold, veterans began to speak out, sharing stories of inadequate equipment, of comrades lost, of the psychological toll. This contributed to the population's growing skepticism about their leaders' competence and honesty. Erosion of the military's prestige. The Soviet military had been one of the pillars of pride for the USSR, celebrated for its role in World War II and as a guardian against Western aggression. Afghanistan tarnished that image. The sight of the mighty Red Army, unable to subdue one of the world's poorest countries, was jarring. Within the military hierarchy, Afghanistan was a source of frustration and embarrassment. Officers saw their units taking losses and making little headway. Strategies shifted from all-out offensives to defending cities and major roads, effectively conceding much of the countryside to insurgents at night. The war also exposed and exacerbated ethnic divides within the army. Soviet units were ethnically mixed, and commanders observed that Central Asian Muslim conscripts often felt little enthusiasm to fight fellow Muslims in Afghanistan. There were instances of desertion or refusal to fight, though not on a scale that crippled operations, but enough to cause concern. Meanwhile, Russian and other Slavic soldiers sometimes harbored racist attitudes toward their Central Asian comrades, blaming them for lapses, which only increased resentment. The war thus chipped away at the unity and morale of the armed forces themselves. By the late 1980s, as Gorbachev's reforms gained momentum, the war in Afghanistan became increasingly untenable. Gorbachev, who inherited the conflict when he came to power in 1985, famously referred to it as a bleeding wound. He was determined to end the war, which he recognized as a stumbling block to both domestic reform and improved relations with the West. Under his direction, the Soviet Union signed accords in Geneva in 1988, agreeing to withdraw. The pullout was completed by February 1989, with columns of tanks and soldiers crossing the Bridge of Friendship back into Soviet territory, a moment met with relief by the Soviet public. There was a sense of a burden lifting, though mixed with sorrow and pride. The government tried to cast the withdrawal as a mission accomplished, but few were convinced by that narrative. Consequences and legacy. The Afghanistan war left a deep imprint. Strategically, it achieved none of its aims. The communist government in Kabul held on for a few years after the Soviet departure, but eventually fell. The Soviet Union gained nothing tangible from the decade of sacrifice. Instead, it got international condemnation. The U.S. led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics in protest of the invasion. A generation of troubled veterans and a blow to its aura of invincibility. The war also had subtle political effects within the USSR. It contributed to the distrust between the Communist Party leadership and the emerging reformers. Hardliners in the military and KGB felt betrayed by the decision to withdraw and the admission of failure. Reformers, on the other hand, saw the war as evidence of the old guard's bankruptcy and used it to argue for more radical changes. Notably, the war's unpopularity meant that when a group of hardliners attempted a coup in 1991, partly to stop the breakup of the Union, they found that the military rank and file and the public were not eager to heed calls for a crackdown. Years of disillusionment, including that bred by Afghanistan, had sapped the will to fight for the old regime. In the various republics, the war also fueled nationalist and anti-Moscow sentiments. In Ukraine, for example, anti-war demonstrations took place, tying the human loss in Afghanistan to the Communist Party's misrule. In the Baltic states, burgeoning independence movements cited the Afghanistan fiasco as one of the many reasons the Moscow rulers had lost legitimacy. Even within Russia, a sense grew that ordinary Russians were bearing the costs of a war that meant nothing to them, feeding into the Russian democratic movement's critique of the Soviet system. In summary, the Afghanistan War acted as both a catalyst and a symptom of the Soviet Union's decline. It strained an already struggling economy, undermined the moral authority of the leadership, and revealed cracks in the unity of the Soviet system. By ending the war, Gorbachev removed one source of bleeding, but the damage was done. The lessons of Afghanistan about the limits of Soviet power and the dangers of imperial overreach came too late to save the Union. The Soviet Union limped out of Afghanistan right into the final tumultuous years of its existence, with an exhausted military and a populace that had lost much of its faith in the path their leaders had set. Gorbachev's reforms, Glasnost and Perestroika. When Mikhail Gorbachev became general, secretary of the Communist Party in March 1985, he inherited a nation in decline, but also a system that had, until then, resisted fundamental change. Gorbachev was a new kind of Soviet leader, relatively young, in his mid-50s, a stark contrast to his geriatric predecessors, energetic and open to fresh ideas. He had risen through the party ranks with a reputation as a reformer in his home region of Stavropol and as a protege of Yuri Andropov. Observing the stagnation and cynicism that pervaded Soviet society, Gorbachev was convinced that the status quo was untenable. To save the Soviet Union, not to dismantle it, but to rejuvenate it, he launched a series of reforms that would prove transformative and ultimately destabilizing. The two keywords of his agenda became glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, early moves, and the push for uskorenie. Initially, Gorbachev did not begin with radical political reform. His early rhetoric focused on uskorenie, meaning acceleration of economic development. The idea was to shake the economy out of stagnation by boosting labor discipline and efficiency, tightening management, and introducing technological modernization. To signal a break from Brezhnev-era complacency, he targeted conspicuous social ills, most famously with a sweeping anti-alcohol campaign launched in 1985. Under this campaign, alcohol production was slashed, sales were restricted to limited hours, and vineyards deemed unproductive were cut down. The policy did achieve a brief improvement in public health and productivity. Statistics showed fewer alcohol-related deaths and higher work attendance initially, but it was deeply unpopular. It deprived many citizens of one of the few readily available comforts, led to long lines for liquor, an explosion of moonshine, Samagon production, and dealt a heavy blow to state revenues, since vodka sales had filled the treasury. This campaign illustrated Gorbachev's style, bold and well-intentioned, but often administratively clumsy and politically risky. On the economic front, Gorbachev and his advisors, like economist Nikolai Ryzhkov, and later Boris Yeltsin and Alexander Yakovlev, the latter more of a political reformer, recognized that tinkering at the margins wasn't enough. The old planning system was simply too rigid and innovation starved to deliver the growth and quality of life improvements needed. By 1986, talk began of perestroika, restructuring the economy to incorporate elements of market flexibility. Perestroika, restructuring the economy. The perestroika reforms attempted to decentralize and energize the economy without abandoning socialist principles. Key measures included the Law on State Enterprises, 1987, which granted factory and enterprise managers more autonomy from central ministries. Enterprises were supposed to be allowed to set their own production levels based on demand and to retain some profits for investment or wage bonuses rather than blindly fulfilling Gosplan's targets. In theory, this would reward efficiency and responsiveness. In practice, it created confusion. Managers, trained for decades to meet fixed quotas with guaranteed state procurement, were unsure how to adjust to partial market signals. Moreover, the state never fully relinquished control. Ministries still often set broad targets and interfered, and the price system remained largely fixed, meaning even if a factory produced more or better goods, prices didn't necessarily reflect consumer demand. Perestroika thus often showed, as one commentator quipped, the worst of both worlds, some chaos of the market without its discipline, and the remaining bureaucracy of the command system without its old certainty. Another dramatic reform was the Law on Cooperatives, 1988, which for the first time since Lenin's new economic policy of the 1920s allowed private enterprise, officially termed cooperatives, in the service sector and small-scale industry. Suddenly, enterprising citizens could open cafes, start handicraft workshops, or engage in trade legally. This led to a blossoming of small businesses, from family restaurants to garages offering car repairs for a fee. Many cooperatives were successful in meeting pent-up demand for better services and goods. But they also highlighted contradictions in the transition. Cooperative goods were sold at market prices, often much higher than the state-subsidized prices people were used to, leading to perceptions of profiteering or inequality. Some cooperatives became infamous for corrupt practices, as the blurry line between public resources and private enterprise allowed shady operators to buy goods cheaply from state stores or use state factory materials and sell them dearly, exacerbating shortages. While cooperatives only ever accounted for a small fraction of the economy, they symbolized a crack in the socialist edifice of state ownership, a prelude to larger shifts. Foreign investment was cautiously welcomed via joint ventures, and Soviet firms began to interact more with the global economy, importing technology and consumer goods when possible. However, the broader economy under perestroika struggled. Without a comprehensive price reform, shortages actually worsened. Gorbachev's team hesitated to free prices, which might have cleared shortages by reducing demand, because that risked hyperinflation and public anger. So they ended up in a halfway situation, some liberalization, but not enough to unleash a true market dynamism or to keep store shelves filled. Between 1987 and 1990, growth slowed further and the budget deficit ballooned, partly due to declining oil revenues, partly due to mismanagement and the expense of reform programs. Glasnost, unleashing openness. If perestroika in the economy had mixed results, Gorbachev's policy of glasnost profoundly changed the social and political landscape. Glasnost, which means openness or transparency, was initially conceived as a way to encourage more honesty in the media and bureaucracy, to expose and remedy problems rather than hide them. It started slowly, an article here, a critique there. But by 1986 to 1987, it gathered revolutionary momentum. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986 became a catalyst. The Soviet authorities' initial secrecy and mishandling of that catastrophe underscored the deadly cost of the old habit of cover-ups. In its aftermath, Gorbachev pushed for more truthful reporting. Under Glasnost, newspapers, magazines, and television began to address previously taboo subjects. Investigative journalists dug into the sordid details of local corruption scandals, revealing graft among factory managers and party officials that would have been hushed up before. The grim facts of Soviet history were brought to light. State media published accounts of Stalin's purges, the mass deportations of entire nationalities, the Gulag prison camps, and the appalling number of innocent lives destroyed in the 1930s and 40s. These revelations were shocking to a public that, though aware in broad strokes that Stalin's era was repressive, had never been allowed to grasp the full magnitude. Films and literature that had been shelved by censors suddenly saw the light of day. Libraries stocked the works of previously banned authors like Solzhenitsyn and Pasternak. Cinema showed movies that dealt with controversial themes or portrayed Soviet life with unvarnished realism. The political discourse also became freer. Citizens experienced something akin to free speech for the first time in Soviet history. They wrote frank letters to editors, held debates at clubs and in student assemblies, and began to organize civic groups around causes like environmental protection, heritage preservation, or informal political discussion called clubs of interest. Intellectuals who had been silent or exiled found platforms to speak. Even on state television, viewers could watch spirited roundtable discussions where participants criticized bureaucratic incompetence or questioned previously sacrosanct policies. Gorbachev intended Glasnost to encourage constructive criticism and support for his reforms. Indeed, it did embolden reformers, but it also opened the floodgates to criticism of the entire Soviet system. The Communist Party found itself in the unfamiliar position of having to defend its record before an increasingly skeptical public. Political reforms and democratization. In tandem with Glasnost, Gorbachev introduced political changes that gradually dismantled the monopoly of power held by the Communist Party. In 1988, the 19th Party Conference approved the creation of a new legislature, the Congress of People's Deputies, with a significant portion of its members to be chosen in competitive elections. This was a radical departure from the past, where all candidates for office were handpicked by the party. In the spring of 1989, millions of Soviets voted in the first somewhat free elections since the 1917 revolution. The campaign itself electrified the nation. Televised debates and candidate speeches revealed a range of viewpoints. Opposition voices, though technically most candidates were still communists or aligned with the party, found a way into the Congress. Boris Yeltsin, who had been ousted from the top party leadership for being too brash a reformer, ran as an independent candidate in Moscow and won a resounding victory, propelled by public enthusiasm for greater change. When the new Congress convened in May to June 1989, its sessions were broadcast live on television, another first. The Soviet people watched, riveted, as deputies openly grilled government ministers, exposed the truths of events like the secret protocol of the Nazi-Soviet pact, and debated new laws. A previously unimaginable pluralism was on display. While the Communist Party still held most levers of power, the genie of democratic politics was out of the bottle. Gorbachev himself was elected to a newly created position of President of the Soviet Union in 1990 by the Congress, trying to shift from pure party rule to a more state-based presidency. One of the most momentous political changes came in early 1990. The Communist Party leadership agreed to repeal Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which had enshrined the party's leading role in society, effectively the legal basis for one-party rule. With that gone, the path was cleared for a multi-party system. Almost immediately, new political clubs and proto-parties sprouted, from liberal reformist groups to more radical nationalist or pro-market parties, as well as a reconstituted Communist Party that soon found itself internally divided between conservatives and liberals. Foreign policy, the new thinking. Gorbachev's reforms extended to foreign affairs, where he advocated a new thinking that de-emphasized class struggle in international relations and sought cooperation with the West. This had a direct bearing on the collapse of the Soviet Outer Empire in Eastern Europe. In 1989, as democratic protests swept through the communist states of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, Gorbachev made a conscious choice not to intervene with force. The long-standing Brezhnev doctrine was effectively abandoned. One by one, the Eastern European satellites broke free of communist rule, with Moscow's acquiescence. While this earned Gorbachev acclaim abroad, including a Nobel Peace Prize in 1990, and eased the burden of empire on the Soviet Union, it also had an unintended boomerang effect. It inspired Soviet citizens and nationalities with the idea that political change, even regime change, was possible at home too. If the Berlin Wall could fall and East Germans could choose reunification with the West, if Poland could have a non-communist government, then perhaps the Soviet Union itself could follow a similar path of sweeping change. Unintended consequences. Gorbachev's goal was to revitalize and preserve the Soviet Union through reform, making socialism more humane and effective. In many respects, however, Glasnost and Perestroika set forces in motion that he struggled to control. The more people learned and spoke out, the more they questioned not just the flaws of the present, but the very foundations of the Soviet system. Why, many asked, did a system that claimed to be the vanguard of progress end up repressing its own people so brutally under Stalin? Why was the economy that was supposed to outpace capitalism now failing to provide basics? As the moral authority of the Communist Party crumbled under the weight of exposed truths, alternative sources of authority emerged, from democratic ideals to nationalist sentiments, as we have seen. Economically, Perestroika's half measures led to further decline and public dissatisfaction, which opponents of reform seized upon to argue that the old ways had been better. Politically, the newly liberated media and nascent civil society sometimes pushed far ahead of what Gorbachev and his reformist circle were comfortable with. They found themselves in a delicate balancing act, pressed by hardliners on one side who thought the reforms were destroying socialism, and by radicals on the other who thought Gorbachev was not going far enough. This growing divide would soon come to a head. In summary, Gorbachev's tenure from 1985 to 1991 was a revolutionary time for Soviet citizens. They experienced more change in those 6 years than in perhaps the previous 30. The Glasnost and Perestroika reforms broke the mold of Soviet life, injecting freedom and uncertainty, hope, and chaos. Gorbachev lifted the lid off a pressure cooker of grievances and aspirations. What came out would prove impossible to stuff back in. As we shall see, the bold attempt to reform the unreformable would instead accelerate the Soviet Union's collapse, a result that Gorbachev neither intended nor desired, but one that his policies inadvertently helped bring about. Reform failures and unintended consequences. By 1990, it was becoming evident that Gorbachev's grand reforms were producing as much chaos as improvement. The Soviet Union was now a freer society, but also a more unruly and economically troubled one. The contradictions of perestroika, the attempt to graft market mechanisms onto a socialist planned economy, began to hit home in everyday life. Instead of rejuvenating the planned economy, the partial reforms destabilized it. As state controls loosened, the intricate machine of supply and distribution, already creaky, started to break down entirely. The late 1980s and 1990 saw the economy lurch into crisis. Store shelves went from understocked to nearly bare. Inflation, previously suppressed by fixed prices, surged once. Some price controls were lifted, and the government's budget deficit widened alarmingly as revenues fell and expenses, like subsidies and defense, remained high. One unintended consequence of Gorbachev's policies was a kind of paralysis in decision-making. The old command system had clear lines of authority. Inefficient, yes, but everyone knew who was responsible for what. Under perestroika, power and initiative were partially devolved to republics and enterprises, but the transition rules were vague. Many local authorities took advantage of the newfound autonomy not to spur production, but to hoard resources for their own region or to defy Moscow's directives they didn't like. For example, some republics began to withhold tax revenues, arguing that they needed funds for their own economies. In 1990, the Russian Republic, under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin as the chairman of its parliament, declared that it would prioritize Russian laws over Soviet laws after its sovereignty declaration, which meant in practice that it might not enforce central economic decrees on its territory. Other republics followed with similar sovereignty declarations. The result was near anarchy in economic coordination. Factories that once relied on supplies from other parts of the USSR suddenly found those supplies delayed or cut off as regional governments asserted control over local production. The tightly interdependent Soviet economy, built on the assumption of a strong center, began disintegrating into pieces. The Communist Party, too, was faltering as the glue of the system. Glasnost had eroded its authority and mystique. No longer could the party claim infallibility. Its history and present were being questioned by society. Membership in the party, once a coveted path to status, became tainted in the eyes of some as people learned of past crimes and current corruption. Within the party's ranks, a split was growing between conservatives, hardliners who wanted to halt or roll back reforms, and liberals who wanted to accelerate them, some even contemplating a multi-party democracy and full market economy. Gorbachev found himself increasingly isolated in the middle, trying to placate both sides and often satisfying neither. The hardliners, particularly in the upper echelons of the KGB, military, and party apparatus, saw perestroika and glasnost as existential threats to the Soviet system and to their own power. They blamed Gorbachev for weakening the party and the Union. To them, the surge of nationalism in the republics, the economic woes, and the loss of the Eastern European bloc all signaled that the reforms had gone too far. They pressed Gorbachev to reassert control, to censor the press again, to crack down on separatists in the Baltics and elsewhere, and to slow or reverse market reforms. Gorbachev, however, believed he could hold the middle ground. He repeatedly assured hardliners that he would preserve the Union and socialism. For instance, he sent troops in early 1991 to seize control of TV towers and government buildings from separatists in Vilnius and Riga, resulting in bloodshed that tarnished his image, while simultaneously telling reformers that there was no turning back from openness and transformation. Walking this tightrope became increasingly impossible. Meanwhile, the liberal reformers grew impatient that Gorbachev's changes were not yielding a better life fast enough. By 1990 to 91, radical economists and some politicians, including Yeltsin, now emerging as Gorbachev's chief rival, were advocating a much swifter move to a market economy, a shock therapy to break the bottlenecks. One notable plan, called the 500 Days Program, was drafted in 1990 by a team of reformist economists. It proposed a rapid transition to a market economy and a restructuring of the Union into a looser economic federation. Initially, Gorbachev showed interest, as did Yeltsin, but under pressure from party conservatives, Gorbachev pulled back and never fully implemented the plan. This back and forth undermined confidence among both domestic and foreign economic actors. It seemed the Soviet leadership had no coherent strategy. They wouldn't commit to a full market transition, but neither could they restore the old system. The consequence was economic freefall. In 1991, the GDP of the Soviet Union contracted sharply. Inflation of previously affordable goods soared as hoarded goods trickled into unofficial markets at high prices, and an outright economic collapse loomed. As the economy unraveled, everyday hardships intensified, fueling public anger. Strikes became more common, notably coal miners in the Donbass region of Ukraine and in Siberia went on strike in 1989 and 1990, venting not only economic grievances, demanding better pay and supplies, but also political ones, calling for the local communist leadership to resign. and even for sovereignty of their republics. These strikes indicated that even the working class, ostensibly the bedrock of Soviet socialism, was disillusioned with the status quo. Public rallies and marches, which had begun as pro-reform or nationalist demonstrations, increasingly featured ordinary citizens protesting living conditions and the paralysis of governance. Another unintended consequence of Gorbachev's reforms was the rise of new political personalities and power centers that challenged the supremacy of the Communist Party. The most significant was Boris Yeltsin. Once a loyal party official and Gorbachev ally, Yeltsin had reinvented himself as an anti-establishment populist champion by 1989, capitalizing on public frustration. In June 1991, while Gorbachev was still president of the Soviet Union, an unelected position at the Union level, albeit chosen by the Congress, Yeltsin ran for and won the newly created post of President of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest republic comprising Russia. Yeltsin won a landslide victory in a popular election, which gave him a direct democratic mandate that Gorbachev lacked. Armed with this legitimacy, Yeltsin was prepared to assert Russian interests even if it meant undermining Soviet institutions. The odd duality now was that Gorbachev was president of a fast-collapsing union, while Yeltsin was president of the increasingly assertive Russian Republic, and the two men had very different visions and constituencies. Throughout 1990 and into 1991, republic after republic took steps that undercut the Union. Some declared full independence. Lithuania boldly did so in March 1990, prompting Gorbachev to impose an economic blockade in an attempt to force them to retract. It didn't work. Others, like Russia, Ukraine, and others, declared the supremacy of their own laws over Soviet laws, effectively nullifying central authority. Moldova dropped the Soviet-imposed name Moldavian in favor of use Romanian as its language, and started talking of possibly reuniting with Romania. Georgia formally declared the independence in April 1991, after a referendum produced an overwhelming yes vote. The centrifugal forces were plainly overtaking the centripetal ones. Confronted with the very real possibility of the Soviet Union breaking apart, Gorbachev, in his final year in power, tried to negotiate a new Union treaty, essentially a revised constitution that would create a looser federation. By summer 1991, after hard bargaining, he had agreement in principle from the leaders of many republics, notably the Baltics and Georgia, refused to consider any new union. They were set on outright independence. The new treaty would grant broad autonomy to the republics, making the Soviet Union more of a symbolic umbrella for independent states than a tightly unified country. Gorbachev believed this was the only way to prevent complete fragmentation while also satisfying nationalist aspirations. The treaty was scheduled to be signed on August 20th, 1991. However, this prospect alarmed the hardliners to an extreme degree. To them, the Union Treaty was the final betrayal, effectively the dissolution of the USSR under a different name, and the end of the Communist Party's central role. These hardline elements, including Gorbachev's own vice president, the defense minister, the KGB chief, and others, decided that Gorbachev's course had to be stopped by force if necessary. They viewed the state as on the brink of collapse and felt a duty to save it, even if it meant toppling the very leader who had unleashed these forces. Thus, the stage was set for the dramatic coup attempt in August 1991, the last gasp of the old guard and a direct consequence of the failures and unintended outcomes of the reform period. The chain of events that Gorbachev's reforms had triggered: economic collapse, loss of party authority, assertive republics, and emboldened opponents, was now racing to a climax. The Soviet Union was like a plane whose engines had failed mid-flight. Whether it could glide to a safe landing as a reformed union or crash entirely was about to be decided in the tense showdown of August 1991. The August 1991 coup attempt. In the gray dawn of August 19th, 1991, Soviet citizens woke to an alarming announcement on state radio and television. A state committee on the state of emergency declared that President Mikhail Gorbachev was unable to perform his duties for health reasons, and that an emergency regime was being instituted to save the country from chaos. The committee, which included Gorbachev's own vice president, Gennady Yanev, as well as the Prime Minister Valentin Pavlov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, KGB Chief Vladimir Khrushchev, and other hardline officials, essentially proclaimed themselves in charge. They ordered tanks and troops into Moscow, imposed censorship, banned strikes and demonstrations, and set a curfew. The news was chilling. It appeared to be a classic coup d'etat by the hardliners, a last-ditch effort to stop the signing of the Union Treaty scheduled for the next day and to roll back the clock on Gorbachev's reforms. In reality, Gorbachev at that moment was a prisoner. He had been on vacation at his dacha in Foros, Crimea, and on August 18th, he was confronted and put under house arrest by the plotters, who demanded he either declare a state of emergency himself or step aside. To his credit, Gorbachev refused to lend legitimacy to the coup. He and his family were isolated, their communications cut, while the conspirators went ahead without him. This meant the emergency committee lacked the veneer of constitutional authority they craved. Even Yanev, the vice president, could only dub himself acting president in Gorbachev's absence, a title that rang hollow. As tanks rolled through the streets of Moscow and armored vehicles took up positions at key locations, the coup leaders expected to cow the population and overawe any resistance. But the Soviet Union of 1991 was not the same as in the days of Stalin or even Khrushchev. Decades of fear had been eroded by the past few years of openness and mobilization. Almost immediately, opposition to the coup galvanized, centered on the Russian Federation's government and its popular president, Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin denounced the coup as unconstitutional and treasonous. He famously climbed atop one of the tanks outside the Russian White House, the Parliament building of Russia, and, in a dramatic scene captured on camera, rallied the crowd of citizens gathered there. Yeltsin, flanked by supporters, read a declaration calling for an immediate end to the junta's actions and urged a general strike. This image of a resolute Yeltsin on a tank became the symbol of the resistance, and in many ways, of a new Russia being born. Crowds of civilians began to build barricades in central Moscow using buses, construction materials, whatever was at hand to protect the White House, where Yeltsin and the Russian leadership were holed up. Crucially, elements of the military began to waver in their support for the coup. Some elite units and much of the KGB's special forces remained loyal to the emergency committee, but many conscript soldiers and even some officers were reluctant to enforce a crackdown on the public. In Leningrad, now beginning again to be called St. Petersburg's, the local military command refused to carry out the coup leader's orders. In Moscow, the commanders hesitated to move aggressively against the demonstrators. The coup leaders themselves were dithering and uncertain. Yanayev appeared on TV with trembling hands and a quavering voice, hardly projecting confidence. They had perhaps counted on a swift, decisive seizure of power, but instead found a growing popular resistance, and their own resolve faltering. Tension filled the air. Moscow braced for a possible armed confrontation the night of August 20th. Sporadic violence did occur. Notably, 3 unarmed men were killed in an underpass as they tried to block armored vehicles advancing toward the White House. They became martyrs for the anti-coup cause, but the feared large-scale bloodshed never materialized. The senior military leadership, sensing the coup's momentum ebbing, balked at plunging the capital into civil war. Some units defected to the side of the protesters, others simply withdrew. By August 21st, after only 3 days of high drama, the coup collapsed. The emergency committee's plans lay in ruins as it became clear they lacked broad support. That morning, news spread that the coup plotters had flown to Crimea to meet Gorbachev, not to harm him, but now to beg his acquiescence or discuss terms. They ended up detained and later arrested. Gorbachev was free. By the evening of the 21st, he was back in Moscow and resumed his office, appearing on television alongside Yeltsin. But though Gorbachev was nominally restored to power, everything had changed in those few days. The failure of the coup was greeted with euphoria in the streets. Crowds celebrated, and Russian tricolor flags, revived as the symbol of democratic Russia, fluttered alongside the Soviet red flags, which were now fading fast in significance. Yet amid the relief, it was evident that the Communist Party's authority had been dealt a mortal blow. The party had been deeply implicated in the coup. Its leading members had either organized it or not resisted it, and its decades-long stranglehold on power was broken at last. Yeltsin wasted no time. He outlawed the Communist Party on Russian soil, seizing its property and archives. One of the most iconic moments came when the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Soviet secret police, was pulled down from its pedestal in front of the KGB headquarters, a powerful symbol that the Soviet order was collapsing. Gorbachev, who had survived captivity and the attempt to undo his life's work, tried to reassert control and called for the Communist Party to purge its hardliners. But history had passed him by in those days of August. Real power had shifted to Yeltsin and the leaders of the other republics. In the aftermath, one republic after another accelerated their moves toward independence, now recognizing that even Gorbachev's goodwill or new Union treaty could not hold the Union together without force, and force had just been discredited. The August coup attempt, ironically, achieved the opposite of its intent. Instead of preserving the Soviet Union, it delivered the final blow. It irreversibly delegitimized the Communist Party and the Central Soviet institutions. In the days following, Gorbachev resigned as General Secretary of the party, effectively dissolving its grip on government, and the Russian government took over what remained of the Union government. Functions in Russia. The stage was set for the final chapter, the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, which loomed just ahead. The final dissolution of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the August coup marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. In its wake, the momentum toward independence in the Union republics became irreversible. Within days, the map of the USSR began redrawing itself. Ukraine, the second most populous republic after Russia, declared independence on August 24, 1991, and announced a referendum for December to confirm it, a referendum that would later pass overwhelmingly. By the end of August, Belarus and Moldova had also declared independence. So did the Caucasus republics of Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. Even the Central Asian republics, historically more hesitant, followed one by one in declaring nationhood. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and others peeled away during the months of September and October. The three Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, whose independence declarations from 1990 had not been recognized by Moscow, now got their de facto independence affirmed. Gorbachev's government formally recognized the Baltic nations' sovereignty in early September 1991, and foreign governments rapidly established diplomatic relations with them. What had been unthinkable mere years earlier was now happening at a breathtaking pace. The Union was falling apart, not in blood and civil war, but through official declarations and the stroke of pens. During these tumultuous months, the balance of power had shifted decisively to the Republican leaderships, especially Boris Yeltsin in Russia. Gorbachev found himself president of a virtually hollow shell. The Central Soviet institutions were rapidly being supplanted or taken over by Russian institutions. For instance, in late 1991, the Soviet Foreign Ministry began handing over embassies and diplomatic responsibilities to the Russian Foreign Ministry, as it was clear that Russia would be the successor state in international affairs. The Soviet armed forces faced a splintering fate as soldiers from different republics pondered whether they would join new national armies. In effect, Gorbachev was presiding over the dissolution of his own country, trying to do so in a managed way if possible. He made one last effort to reconstitute some form of union, a looser commonwealth that could maintain economic ties and avoid total chaos. This idea evolved into the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS. But it was not Gorbachev who would create it. Instead, in early December 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus took the initiative. On December 8, 1991, Boris Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarusian leader Stanislav Shushkevich met secretly at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest in Belarus. There they signed the Belovezha Accords, which stated bluntly that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and geopolitical reality, was ceasing to exist, and announced the formation of the CIS in its place, an entity that would be a loose association of independent states with no strong central power. They pointedly did not invite Gorbachev to this meeting. It was a fait accompli presented to him and the world. A week later, on December 21st, 8 more republics, including several Central Asian states, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, joined the SALUS by signing the Alma-Ata Protocol. Only Georgia, which would join later in 1993, and the 3 Baltic states, which wanted no part of any post-Soviet association, stayed out. The CAUS agreement affirmed each member's independence and equality, effectively serving as the divorce papers for the Soviet Union. Facing these realities, Gorbachev had little choice but to acquiesce. He had not been able to save the Union in the form he wanted, but he could ensure an orderly and peaceful transfer of power. On December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev addressed the Soviet people on television. In a dignified, somber speech, he announced that he was resigning as president of the USSR, an office that would now be effectively abolished. He recounted the achievements and difficulties of his tenure, expressed regret at the collapse of the Union, but affirmed that the people's democratic will must prevail, and wished the citizens well. It was a poignant moment. The last leader of the Soviet Union signing himself out of a job and a country. That evening, at the Kremlin in Moscow, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the final time and replaced with the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. A state that had existed for nearly 7 decades and had been a superpower shaping world history was no more. The following day, December 26, 1991, the upper chamber of the Soviet Parliament, the Soviet of Republics, met one last time. Lacking a quorum of Republic representatives, since most had already left, the remaining members adopted a brief resolution acknowledging the dissolution of the Soviet Union and sent notices to the United Nations and foreign governments that the USSR had ceased to exist. With that, the Union's last formal institutions have faded away. The Russian Federation assumed the USSR's seat at the United Nations Security Council and took control of the former Soviet nuclear arsenal in cooperation with the other nuclear-armed newly independent states, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The world now had 15 new independent countries where the Soviet Union once stood. The end came relatively quietly, not with the bang of war and chaos that many had feared, but with signatures and lowered flags. This peaceful aspect was in no small measure due to the restraint of Gorbachev and the common understanding among the Republic's leaders that violence would benefit no one. Nonetheless, enormous challenges lay ahead. The economies of these new states were deeply interlinked and now had to be disentangled. Political power struggles within them were just beginning, and ethnic conflicts that the Soviet regime had long suppressed were now free to erupt. Some, like in the Caucasus, already had. For ordinary people, the dissolution brought a mix of emotions. There was hope that independence or the new political freedoms would lead to better governance and prosperity. There was also uncertainty and fear. What would happen to prices, jobs, pensions, and personal security in this brave new world? Many felt pride in their national rebirth. Others felt the pang of loss for the country of their birth, especially ethnic Russians who suddenly found themselves living outside Russia in foreign lands, or those who simply had identified with the Soviet Union and its ideals. History's verdict on the Soviet Union's end is complex. What's clear is that its collapse was the culmination of a long, slow process, decades of systemic weaknesses, years of stagnation, a burst of reform and openness that unintentionally loosened the bonds holding it together, and the courageous or desperate actions of individuals at critical moments. Unlike many empires of the past that went down in flames of war, the Soviet Union's final collapse was, in keeping with the tone of much of this narrative, a relatively peaceful sunset. The slow decline had reached its conclusion, and a new dawn was breaking for the former Soviet republics, now embarking on separate journeys. Thus, on that cold December night in 1991, as the Soviet flag came down over Moscow, the long story of the Soviet Union quietly ended. A chapter in world history closed, not with jubilant fanfare or catastrophic explosion, but with a somber, meditative final act, in many ways befitting the slow, persistent, and peaceful collapse that had been unfolding for years.